This podcast contains explicit language, disturbing and sensitive topics, controversial discussions, and may be triggering to some. Please take this into consideration before listening. Today, we are wrapping up our first mini-series about sexual assault and rape in the United States. But before we dive into this conversation, I want to correct myself with something that I stated in episode 1 during my conversation with Leisha. It's something that's kind of been sitting not so well with me since I stated it, and I do want to address it. I stated that I had never been sexually assaulted in my life, but that I'd only been groped in public several times in my life. And I was wrong, and I was wrong in making that statement. Groping is a form of sexual assault, and I don't want to minimize that and want to lead anyone to believe that groping is not, or groping is appropriate, or groping is okay. The definition of sexual assault is any sexual contact that involves force upon a person without consent or is inflicted upon a person who is incapable of giving consent, either such as age or physical or mental capacity, or who places the assailant, such as a doctor, in a position of trust or authority. So groping is a form of sexual assault, and I don't want to minimize it because groping without consent is indeed committing assault against another person, and it's not okay. So I apologize for that statement. As soon as it came out of my mouth that day, I immediately started questioning it in my mind, and it hasn't been sitting with me well since. So I wanted to address that before we move forward. This is Powerful Conversations Humanhood, a podcast where we confront America's adopted psychopathic nature by diving headfirst into difficult and honest conversations about the state of humanhood. I'm your host, Tamara Graham, with co-host Leisha Moody Miller. We welcome you to the conversation. This episode is sponsored by Square 5, powerful products that confronts our internal dialogue to help inspire our external dialogue for a more purposeful, driven world. Command your voice at square5.com. That's SQUARE5IVE.com. Rape is as American as baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. Today, we are wrapping up our first mini-series about sexual assault and rape in the United States. In our first 2 episodes, we heard Leisha's own story about her rape at the hands of a stranger and her journey through justice and healing. In our second episode, we heard from Rick, a father and soccer coach, and his story of sexual assault of 3 of his athletes by the hands of his respected fellow coach and friend. One of those survivors was Rick's own daughter. In this episode, Leisha and I dive a bit deeper into the pervasiveness of sexual assault in the U.S. We discuss the trauma it causes, how to heal from it, and then we also talk more about rape kit testing, why they don't get tested, and what we can do to get more tested. Before we dive into the discussion, I want to share some statistics from RAINN.org. RAINN stands for Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. It's the largest anti-sexual violence organization in the U.S. They run the National Sexual Assault Hotline as well as partner with over 1,000 local sexual assault service providers across the country. They also operate the DoD Safe Helpline for the U.S. Department of Justice. So they are the preeminent voice of anti-sexual assault in the country. For the sake of this conversation, we're going to focus on some overarching stats that add to our canvas that helps paint the picture of the pervasiveness of sexual assault within our society. If anyone is interested in diving deeper into the stats, you can visit RAINN.org. Every 68 seconds, someone is being sexually assaulted in the United States. Every 9 minutes, that victim is a child. Every year in the United States, 1 out of 6 women experiences sexual assault. 1 in 3 females are between the ages of 11 and 17. 1 in 33 men experience an attempted or completed rape. Transgender and people with disabilities are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted. The ages of 12 to 34 are the highest risk years for rape and sexual assault. Females ages 16 to 19 are 4 times more likely than the general population to be victims of sexual violence. Women ages 18 to 24 who are college students are 3 times more likely than women in general to experience sexual violence. 70% of sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows. Only 25 of every 1,000 perpetrators will end up in prison. Out of those who do end up in prison, 97% of them spend less than 6 months in jail. We've seen over the past few years how pervasive sexual assault is on college campuses. We've all heard of Larry Nassar at Michigan State and Jerry Sandusky at Penn State. Just this week in March of 2020, the University of Michigan finalized a lawsuit brought by over 1,000 former students, mostly men, that includes a $490 million payout and forced changes on how the school protects the campus from sexual assault. Later in this podcast, we'll discuss the story of one of those former students, Jon Vaughn, also known as John Doe number 32. So, Leisha, what do you think contributes to rape culture in America? Why do you think it is so pervasive within our society?
There is still very much a purity culture in our country, and that purity culture sees preserving your sexual chastity at all costs. So, in that sense, it's very hard for people to talk about sexual crimes. It's very hard to not be embarrassed or deeply ashamed about that being in your history as a victim. So it leads to, not enough people being able to be honest about what's happened to them, and a lot of perpetrators not really answering for their crimes. And that has been here forever. I mean, we've had a very hard time in our culture coming to terms with sex crimes.
Yeah, I think there's like this level of shame that we put on people unnecessarily so. I don't know why we do this as a society, but we really base people's reputations on whether their promiscuity or their sexual activity defines who they are as a person. We place sex workers at such a low level in society, and if we find out that, someone that we know sleeps around or is promiscuous, we label them sluts, especially females in this country. And with men, we kind of just like, that's man being a man being a man, basically. But it's curious to me why we put, when it comes to sex, why we put such harsh labels on people, why we use sex as a form of determining someone's worth. And then we have a hard time talking about it in society. And then we say things like, when it comes to rape and sexual assault or sexual violence, the first question out of so many people's mouths is male and female alike, what is it that you were doing to cause it? What did you do to deserve it?
And the question really should be, why does our society permit people to perpetrate these crimes? Not every question should be directed at the people committing the crimes.
Yeah, why don't we take it seriously?
Why are we ever questioning a victim? Because we don't know how, maybe, to question perpetrators in a way to hold them accountable across the spectrum, because we know a lot of perpetrators get away with their crimes. If they have enough money or power or influence, they may never answer for what they've done. And that's very frightening when you consider the statistics that most people are not answering for what they've done. Very small percentage are answering for the crime.
Yeah, 25% of reported sexual assaults, 25 out of every 1,000 reported sexual assaults receive a punishment.
So that's not very encouraging for victims to come forward when they know that going through the legal process might result in that perpetrator walking free. And that's very hard to go through that process. We forget that we're asking traumatized people to go through a process that's long and arduous and difficult
And re-traumatizing them in a sense.
and re traumatizing. And it's a very hard thing to get resolution on. I mean, even in my situation, it took, ultimately 20 years, over 20 years from start to finish. That's not always the case, but the processes of trying to get justice can be very long and very tiring. So, I mean, I wish there was a more emphasis put on teaching healthy boundaries, healthy connections from to everyone when they're very young. We don't have to tolerate any kind of boundary intrusion, whether that be groping someone. When I was in elementary school, people like to pop people's bras. Do you remember that?
Yep, I do actually.
And do you remember how you felt as a girl if somebody popped your bra?
Yeah, well, it pissed me off is what it did.
It made you feel icky.
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes you get pissed off, sometimes you get embarrassed, but ultimately it made you feel icky. That's why you reacted, right? And we tolerated that because no one was telling those boys or whoever to stop doing that.
Or slaps on the ass, coming up from behind you and slapping you on the ass. That was something that happened quite a lot too at my school.
And I had my own boundary violations. I remember I used to do this thing with people, with my girlfriends. We'd be walking down the hall and I'd come up behind them and pull their, if they had like a pull-up skirt, I'd pull it down a little bit where you could see their underwear. But I think about that now and how I wasn't cluing in to I was really invading her space.
For sure.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that was what I wasn't taught too. I wasn't taught that it's okay to have a boundary up about your own body, and it's not okay to invade somebody else's
I
boundaries.
think boundaries in the '70s and '80s were non-existent. And I think that's why those of us from that generation struggle with boundaries in our lives, with family, with friendships, with relationships. It doesn't matter what type of relationship it is. I know I personally have struggled with boundaries my entire life because I grew up without boundaries and I grew up with people constantly doing whatever the hell they wanted to do and say whatever the hell they wanted to say and not caring about how it affects the person. And I do think we are reliving that right now in our society, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, where, society has been seemingly given the permission to be assholes again and not have consequences. Well, you just need to just not be so sensitive. You need to suck it up. You need to pull yourself up from the bootstraps. You need to stop acting like you're a victim. No, I don't think people are acting like victims. I think people are standing up and using their voice and saying, "Hey, you are crossing my boundary and it is not okay." And the people who are reacting negatively to that are the ones who are truly have the problem with boundaries, who grew up without boundaries, who don't want to take an inner look at how they're behaving and how their behavior affects everyone else. It's just like, this is who I am. You need to accept this. This is who I am. This is not okay. And I think that's another thing that's pervasive within our society. And I think people are really starting to stand up against that again. I feel like we did for a really long time and we started making some progress. But over the past 4 to 5 years, we've kind of regressed a bit. And, now we're seeing people starting to stand up again against that. And now we're talking about mental health and trauma so much more in society. We're talking about boundaries so much more in society and the importance of them.
And I would encourage anyone to do this, but I think it's an especially powerful tool for a woman. And that is to do a timeline of your boundary crossings that you've experienced with other people. Start when from your earliest memories and draw out this is what happened when I was 5, this is what was happened when I was 7, and just do the entire timeline. And don't exclude it because it seems too minor. It doesn't have to be sexual assault. Anytime you felt like your boundaries were violated. And if you do that and you look at your whole lifespan, then you see that none of us are immune from a certain amount of trauma. It it may differ on what kind of trauma we experience, but when you talk about childhood trauma and you encapsulate it, serious boundary violations for children are traumatic. And so it doesn't have to be sexual abuse for a child to experience trauma. When that child experiences trauma, it carries that trauma into adulthood. And here's the very interesting thing they're learning. Not only is it carried into adulthood, it's carried in our genetics. We are hardwired for trauma in a way that if we've experienced it and our brains have changed, it can be intergenerational in how it's passed down. We actually saw this with Holocaust victims, grandchildren of Holocaust victims. Some of it's passed down in the culture that we develop, the extreme culture of,
Abuse?
huh?
Of abuse? Like the culture of the United States. I would say I would look at the culture of the United States growing up, being a child of the '70s and '80s. I would say the culture of the United States with people in my generation, and we're not seeing this so much in millennials and Gen Zs now. Is that what my son's generation is? Gen Z? I forget all these labels. But I think this is a very good point, and it's something that you and I briefly discussed at one point, but we have all these people and, on social media, you see it just rampant with people from our generation that I grew up getting my ass beat. I was abused
Yes.
and I turned out all right. I'm here to tell you, if your first inclination to any conflict is to beat someone's ass, that you need to beat your child's ass. If that is your first response and you think beating your child is gonna get them to listen or is gonna discipline them, you are mistaken. What you're doing is training your child that abuse is okay, and 9 times out of 10, and I'm not gonna say always because I didn't grow up, I was an abused child, and my father was a very abusive man, and I did not grow up abusing my son or abusing other people. I have my own traumatic experiences from that and how I respond to people. That's where my issues came into play. But I didn't grow up to beat my son and to discipline my son the way that I was disciplined, and I think anybody who advocates for that, I would pose this question to them. If you think beating a child is okay or beating someone's ass or they need to get knocked on their ass and taught a lesson, quote unquote. If you and your wife or your spouse or your partner has a conflict, is the first thing that comes out of your mouth, I need to beat her ass, his ass, their ass in order to teach them a lesson? That's not something we do as adults. So why are we as adults taking that out on children and thinking that beating a child is going to discipline them?
Not only that, but the culture is not just if we turn around and do it ourselves, it's also that we develop a culture of, like you said, with Gen X, we think, oh, we're tough, we can handle anything, we don't need any help. That bodes its own cultural problems,
Our
right?
generation is messed up.
So,
It is.
like if I look back and I look at the fact that I was pretty much left to my own devices, I could call that what it was, as I learned when I got older, that I was emotionally neglected in a lot of ways.
Right.
My parents did not care about what I was feeling.
Yeah. No,
They didn't want
it's
to talk
so
about my
true.
feelings.
It's so
They didn't want to talk
true.
about it. But it wasn't that I turned around and did the exact same things. I didn't want to do the exact same things, but I did develop a sense of I'm not supposed to feel anything bad. I'm not supposed to let myself feel bad about anything. And so that created its own problems because I didn't know how to really I've always minimized my own pain. But here's the other thing, I have a lot of empathy for others, and I've almost called myself empathic. That stems from trauma.
Sure it does. I know mine does. Mine
Mine
100%
stems
does.
from the fact that I wanted to keep my parents happy and keep them okay. So I learned how to tune in to when they weren't okay. And I tuned in so well that as an adult, what else did I wanna do but tune into other people's problems? But I didn't know how to tune into my own. I had to learn that. So we all develop those patterns, and that's what's intergenerational too, but they've actually discovered on a genetic level, trauma is passed down. So, like, what happens to our brains and how our brains are changed with trauma, like hypervigilance or trying to, actually tune in, be hyper tuned in to other people, or what did the grandchildren from the Holocaust learn? You don't talk about it, right? You don't talk about your problems.
I hate that. Yeah, that's how I grew up too.
And my dad never would talk about being in the military. He just kept all that stuff to
Well, my
himself.
dad did. My dad was the opposite. My dad was a Vietnam vet and, in the Tet Offensive, and he suffered from acute PTSD his entire life afterwards, and he talked about it. He talked about it he did it when he was drunk, which was
Oh,
pretty
yeah.
fairly often, but if he were sober, he didn't talk about it, but if he was drunk, he opened up about it, so we heard stories growing up, and he took it out on his family, so I have this statement that I say, "I grew up Vietnam," and I'm not alone in that. There are so many kids whose parents were in Vietnam or fathers were in Vietnam and experienced PTSD and the result of PTSD and not getting the help those veterans not getting the help that they need very explicitly, and it changes generations, it changes a family's dynamic, and it affects families for generations. Who I am today has a lot to do with that experience and growing up that way.
And the early research that was done on trauma was done in the battlefield. They really learned about trauma in World War One and World War II, and that's when they learned about keeping the soldier with his unit was less harmful than taking him away. You had to get his brain, you had to get him decompressed and try to minimize some of his trauma, but get him back to the front lines as much as possible because his unit was his lifeline.
Yeah. Well, my father made a statement. It's very interesting because my dad made a statement once. He was 24 when he got back. He was 24. He actually went into the service twice. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade and my grandmother signed him to join the army at 17 and his first tour was in the 82nd Airborne and he was in Korea. Then he went back in with Vietnam, was, assigned to the 101st Airborne, where he was in the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and he made this statement, like, when he finally came home my dad was a Purple Heart recipient also. When he came home, he's like, "Within a 48-hour period, I was on the battlefield, like, literally murdering women and children. 48 hours later, I was standing in the living room of my parents' home in Michigan." There was no decompression, there was nothing. He was in probably the most intense chaos that a person could be in, and 48 hours later, he was standing in his parents' living room without any skills, without any way to cope with what he just went through and was expected to come back and just live his life normally.
And that's what they didn't do. They didn't prepare people for post-military life. They prepared them to stay alert enough to continue to fight, but they didn't prepare them how to live after they were done fighting. And that's what the military has been. Well, there's a long way to go. The military's tried to implement different trauma strategies with their treatment programs, but I think they're grossly underfunded by the government.
Oh, for sure. The rate of suicides in our military is horrific.
Our veterans should be our top priority. I mean, we've asked them to go to the brink, and they should get every service available to them and more. But we did learn about how trauma did affect people acutely, and we often talk about the acute impact of trauma, which is really the time immediately following the trauma. And so that gets a lot of attention because it's very obvious. A person who has just been in the battlefield, they will experience flashbacks, they will experience nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming, almost being catatonic, probably sometimes, where they just can't even do anything. Definitely over medicating, just trying to minimize those symptoms. That's what we think of when we think of trauma. And that's what happens at a very acute level. But that is just the beginning of the trauma story. Because after that, trauma creeps up into your hippocampus, which is affecting your learning and development. So, this is really important for children. And this is how they say children's brains are changed by trauma. Many children who've experienced trauma have learning issues at school. They're often labeled with different educational labels, but much of it may be related to what they're going through. So every learning disability not every learning disability is something that's just isolated in and of itself.
I would guess that most of it isn't. I don't know what the statistic is, but because it's just exploded, I don't know if it's just diagnoses, but I think we're medicating kids without getting to the why of why we're medicating kids. What's going on in their life? Why are they responding the way that they're responding? And we're labeling it ADHD or ADD.
Well, little boys in particular will act out. So when they experience traumatic events, they act out and they look like conduct disorders and they look like ADHD. They're all over the place. There can't be, that's a common tool trying to cope for little boys. Little girls often will shut down
That
or
was me.
become anxious
That makes
or become
sense.
depressed,
Yeah,
you know?
that was me.
And some of that's cultural, of course, in our gender roles, but there's a lot of things, you're right, that can overlap with traumatic responses. So when a child is being evaluated, it's very important to be honest with their practitioner about their trauma history if you know it. There's no benefit in hiding maybe that they were in a bad car accident when they were 5 years old. Those things are important to truly assessing a child because the treatment for these issues is very different. If a child is truly ADHD, they receive medication often in a behavioral plan, right? But a child with post-traumatic stress needs a very different kind of treatment than a child with ADHD. So it's very important to make sure that you talk about traumas. They don't mean you're a bad parent. Just if your child, many children will experience environmental stress, just the stress of the COVID, all the pandemic stress. I mean, children are very susceptible to images and so we are going to experience a lot of impacts from the past 2 years just mental health wise. And some of that's going to be trauma from kids losing loved ones to the disease all the way down to being isolated for so long. We're still yet to see the full ripple effect from COVID on a mental health.
And there were points that were brought up several times throughout COVID. We're not done with COVID. COVID's not done. But there were a lot of conversations that I've read out in the media. We're putting kids with COVID because we're being isolated, and I totally understand this. We're putting kids in an environment where they may be getting abused more often because school was kind of an escape for them. And now they're back in the home with parents who may be very abusive. And with these statistics, this isn't an exaggeration. When you read the statistics on sexual assault in this country, and these are reported cases. So they're not even all of the cases. And
Right.
we're putting kids back in environments where they're being abused and they have no outlet. So just the mental trauma from that alone, I mean, what we're gonna see that start to play out when a lot of these kids are in their teens, preteens, teenagers, young adults. That is when this is really gonna show itself, right? Or am I wrong in that? They may act out now, but I think the largest part of it is really gonna come out when they start to be a little bit older. Am I wrong in that?
Well, there are definitely signs after a sexual trauma, and a lot of people say, "How do I know? What do I look for?" You will see in the acute phase, you will see all of those things probably. You'll see all kinds of depression, anxiety, panic attack. You'll see nightmares. If you're able to see these things from your loved one, they'll be having nightmares, they'll be having flashbacks. They will be in survival mode. That base part of our brain is survival brain. Sometimes some people call it the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain only has one job, it's to survive. And so when you're faced with a sexual assault, your primary responses are fight, flight, or freeze, right? Fight is, I'm going to try to get my way out of this. That's my first instinct. If I can't get out of it, I'm going to try to run as soon as possible. Or if I can't physically run, I might do something called disassociation, where I actually run in my head. My head goes on vacation. Many people talk about leaving their body during this time, like an out of body experience. That is a normal traumatic response. If you can't physically get away, you may try to run in your head. And then there's freezing, which is essentially you become like a rabbit. You know how a rabbit will freeze if it senses danger? You'll just become immobilized, really. But they've also discovered two more. Flopping is like beyond freezing, where your body goes limp. And this is an interesting phenomenon when people who may have experienced multiple sexual assaults or even one a sexual assault, At some point, they may actually lose control of their body. And then there's friending. Friending is actually where you try to seek help, even trying to get the perpetrator to stop, trying to appeal or fawn or go to a level where you feel like, somebody else can help. And many times that doesn't work either. But those are secondary responses. Primarily, it's fight, flight, or freeze. But what happens when you're in that fight, flight, or freeze is you're in survival brain. So, what happens after the trauma with the survival brain? The survival brain is still in survival mode. So for complex trauma, people who, especially kids who experience lots of trauma over time, their brain almost gets stuck in survival mode. And that makes it really hard for them to trust anybody, not be always on guard, expecting for the next shoe to drop, something bad's going to happen any second. And when you're in survival brain, your upper levels of your brain can't function. So your feeling brain, which is your midbrain, those are cut off from you. So you're not able to appropriately express feelings. And then your upper brain or your frontal lobe, especially, is all about cognition and thought. So you're not able to be reasonable or rational in survival brain. And so we almost expect people with complex trauma to just heal, like snap your fingers. Their brains have been hardwired for trauma, hardwired, which means you're going to have to go back and retrain the brain on how to move up and get out of survival mode. And it's very interesting that we're just now starting to learn these things about kids who've gone through horribly traumatic experiences. We're just now learning how to recognize where they are in their brain. But for a person, an adult who has a crisis or a traumatic event, after they go through that acute stage, they almost go through a period where they look like everything's fine. They want to try to appear normal. They want to feel normal, so they try to act normal. They try to act as if they're okay. And that can work for a long time for a lot of people, especially, you hear a lot of the gymnastic victims of Larry Nasser talking about how they just work 10 times harder.
It was a form of therapy for them, yeah. I totally understand that.
It was a way for them to feel like they were adjusting. But then the bravery that Simone Biles was showing at the last Olympics, in my opinion, was she was showing that she had gone beyond the outward period of adjustment and moved into her integration phase. And the integration phase is, and sometimes it's healing, it's what it is, but healing can be messy. And what she was trying to say at the Olympics was, I need to take time for myself. I need to set a boundary for me. And that was all very healing. But she took a lot of flack for that. And she was told that it wasn't okay for her to do that by some people. And it's the most healing thing you can do is to acknowledge your pain and acknowledge that sometimes you need a break and sometimes you need support.
Yeah, and why do we have to seek permission from strangers or other people who don't understand any trauma that we experienced? Why do we have to seek permission from them or society on what is best for us? And it's that whole it
Right.
just that just loops back to this whole mentality that we have in this country right now to just suck it up and move forward and stop being a crybaby victim. I'm so sick of that rhetoric. I'm telling you, it makes me wanna choose violence, honestly. It's a horrible rhetoric that we have.
Well, and that's why I think that white people in particular do this, and we do this a lot when people of color in particular talk about their own experiences, intergenerational experiences of coming through what they came through with slavery and murder and torture and all the things that black and brown and indigenous people went through. And a lot of white people will say, "That was a long time ago, just get over it."
Right.
Until your family has experienced what I mean, how it's the most arrogant thing you could ever say, and it's the most aw I remember after the Me Too movement, after you remember when Rose McGowan came out, a lot of men were very uncomfortable with her vocal nature. and with her kind of in your face, because she was done. She was over it. And I told somebody in particular, I said, if you had been through what she had been through, how do you know that you wouldn't be as angry as she is right now? You know, we have to stop assuming we know what other people feel and experience. We don't know their experiences. And my dad always told me, never judge a man till you've walked a mile in his shoes.
Absolutely.
And because we can't walk a mile in most people's shoes, then what we're left with is empathy. And empathy means simply not judging, but simply trying to be there for someone else, or simply trying to, as much as you can, put yourself in their shoes. And we don't do that. We jump to conclusions, we judge, we name call. Social media is terrible.
It is. It's horrific. It's horrific. It really is.
Somebody exposes their vulnerabilities and they're just attacked for it. I mean, it's just, where's the love? Where's the, we're all one people,
Humanity.
we're
Yeah.
humanity. We're
We're human.
humans.
We don't care enough, and that's on society. We're all about the rugged individual in this country and not about the collective. That's where this psychopathic nature that I say that, we've developed as a country, it's like people are so apt to not be a victim, but the ones who are screaming, "Don't be a victim," are the ones who are behaving like a victim and who are blaming everyone else for their ills in society and are blaming the rest of us for why society is falling apart when they are the ones who are the biggest perpetrators of that because they don't wanna deal with what is happening in society. They don't wanna have the difficult conversations. They don't wanna own their own behavior and they wanna just name call and blame everyone else, the rest of us, for things being bad or wrong or whatever adjective you wanna use.
Well, the irony is that people who are outwardly very insecure, and not comfortable at all in their own skin and can't ask for what they need, and the people who are outwardly extremely overly secure and are narcissistic and sociopathic in their view of how little others matter, it all comes from the same place. It all comes from a place of shame. And so when we start allowing other people their experiences and not trying to minimize their experiences, people in our lives we love, perhaps they can feel more secure in expressing their own feelings. And, we break the cycle, but we just simply cannot break the cycle when we are not empathetic and not truly caring about other people's experiences, even if we can't 100% empathize. I will never be in a place as a white woman to judge a BIPOC
Same here, yeah,
experience.
we can't.
I'll never be able to, and I
Right.
should never want to, ever. I listen and I learn from them. And we don't we can listen and learn from trauma survivors.
That's an important point, and with sexual assault victims is we're not hearing them. Even when they're stating it and coming out, we're starting to listen more, and I say we, I mean society as a whole, because there are those of us who listen and who are there, but when they come out and they speak against their trauma, we have to empathize with them. We have to practice compassion and empathy toward them. We have to listen and we have to learn because if we're gonna change any of this in society and start holding people accountable and not just giving them a slap on the wrist or a pat on the back in many respects, or, this is just men will be men, or this is just how it is, and if we don't practice that, we're never going to change it. If we don't listen, we're never going to change it. If we don't hear people, we're never going to change it. We have to listen to each other and have conversations with each other and learn from each other. It is the only way that we're going to solve any problems that we have in this country. And we have a plethora of them. And we respond to all of them seemingly in the same way. We blame the victims and we don't blame the perpetrators. So I feel like I've read this somewhere before, but I couldn't find an actual statistic that the percentage of perpetrators for sexual assault or sexual violence are are white males. It's a white person's crime. Right.
Like serial killers.
School shooters. Why are we not addressing this? We think it's a racist thing that, when we bring up the crimes of white people. Why are we not talking about that louder in this society? Why is that conversation being shut down?
I don't know. We have a long way to go with this. I mean, just in particular, the school shooter situation. We are not addressing a serious deficit of mental health skills going on and resources. I mean, we do not have enough teen resources right now. We do not have enough school resources. I mean, there's plenty of talk about school, but it's not on what the focus needs to be on. It's not about helping the mental health crisis of our teenagers. It's worrying about curriculum, or things that are always going to be voted on in the public school, but there's no focus on mental health, which I know we'll get into in another episode, but but I mean, school shooters are kids who are marginalized for sure. They're typically white. They're typically not in the in crowd. They're typically not necessarily outwardly mentally ill, though. Their parents often talk about not seeing any signs. Sometimes that's not true, but some of the moms have spoken and talked about, how they wish they could have seen something.
Sure, and then the parents are blamed as well, well, in the case of the Michigan school shooter, they had a large role in that, but that his parents did, the one that just happened here a few months ago at Oxford. But back to your point you making there, I remember watching a documentary on Dylan Klebold's mother from Columbine.
Yes, I watched that.
Oh my god, I wanted to go through the screen and give that woman a hug. She had me bawling. She had me bawling, and I have so much empathy for her, for what she experienced, and she and her family, I mean, the families of those 2 boys just have been put through hell.
That's what that kind of thing does if you want to circle fully back around to trauma, the ripple effect from those events to the families of the shooters, the families of the victims, the people present in the school, the emergency workers at the scene. You're talking about the trauma effects to hundreds of people over one event. And what that does to their families and their other people in their lives. It was so it's so gut wrenching to watch, families go through what they go through with school shootings. And I don't know, it just feels like it's an epidemic here in America, and it's a white problem.
It is, yeah.
But gun violence is definitely a problem that affects all cultures. But anyway, one of the things I think we can try to empathize with and understand from this whole conversation is when people experience trauma that they're not always going to be okay, and pulling up themselves up by their bootstraps is not always an option. And we've got plenty of people surviving trauma every day for a million different reasons. We just have to be more sensitive to that, and we have to try to listen and learn and not judge.
What is the best way if you went through a traumatic experience, what are the first steps that a parent or a person, if it's an adult, should take to address the issue? What do you think are the first steps? Because I feel like, and this was for me, growing up the way that I did with my father, who is very abusive, my brain developed under chaos and trauma. And, I've explained to you through conversation how, when I think about my childhood, there's nothing positive that I remember. When I think about my childhood, I think about all the trauma that I went through. I think of very specific incidents in my life, and I can talk about it now. There were, decades where I couldn't talk about it. There were decades where I was ashamed about it, but I have done enough healing in my life to where now I can talk about it and not break down, you know? There was, like, a very long period of time where I couldn't. Growing up that way, I knew not everybody grew up that way because none of my friends growing up experienced the level of trauma that I did. Nobody else's parents were like mine, and, nobody else's father was like my father. So, I had a plethora of friends that never had this kind of trauma, so they grew up developing in a very different way than I developed. And so my brain developed under chaos and trauma, and it really wasn't until my 20s when I first met my ex-husband that I really started knowing how to deal with it. He brought a lot of things to my attention about how I respond to certain things and the way I respond to things. And you go back and you talk about that fight or flight. I always fought. My first instinct was to fight, but then my second instinct was flight. And I would disappear on people without conversation, without explanation. I ended friendships over the stupidest shit. I look back at the friendships that I've ended and the relationships that I had, which is a whole other which is a whole other conversation, but 'cause I responded in those situations very differently, but in friendships, I ended a lot of friendships over nothing. I also found myself being very uncomfortable around people who didn't have trauma, if that makes sense. So in a sense, I kinda trauma bonded with people. I was drawn to people who also had trauma, and I felt more connected to those people, and I don't know, I felt like I could be more myself with those people in some respects, but it wasn't until I met my husband and he really encouraged me because he went through an incredibly traumatic experience himself with his mother. His mother committed suicide, and he, at 17, carried her dead body, and it was an inc and she committed suicide by fire. She set herself on fire, and, they're from the country of India, so it's something that's not uncommon there, and he was 17 years old carrying her, dead, burnt body, and I can't even imagine what that experience would be like, but it was kinda like we were kind of like a healing for each other, but, I look back now, and that was 25 years ago when we first met. I look back now and I see the bond that he and I made was a trauma bond. I didn't realize it and recognize it at that time. We went through, 14 years of marriage, not really addressing it. We were kind of a healing for each other in the beginning, but then after we had our son, it kinda separated, and it stopped working, and we allowed our trauma each of us allowed our trauma response to things, our traditional trauma response to lead us in our marriage from that point on, and it ended it. And then after 9/11 here was very significant for him too because, it was guilt by association. He was from India. So it really wasn't until my 40s that I started realizing that a lot of the relationships that I had with people who were really close to me, who I felt were close, was because they went through a traumatic experience also. I mean, I had friends that didn't, and I consider them good friends to this day, but I never bonded with them at the level that I did with people who went through traumatic experiences. And I also found that in my romantic relationships. With my husband, I can recognize it now. And then after our divorce, the past 11 years, the romantic relationships I got myself into relationships with people who had avoidant personalities that triggered my trauma. I started really recognizing that over the past 5 or 6 years. And so, once I started recognizing that, and especially over the past few years with a couple of, relationships that I went through with people, my response to romantic relationships is 100% a trauma response. And I'm 52 years old, and it took me nearly my entire life, and I've had therapy, I've gone through self-help, I've taken courses, I've done so many things to deal with my trauma and growing up, and I really didn't really start learning about it until the last 5 years, honestly, and really recognizing my pattern through my entire life and how it has affected literally my entire life. And it's really made me acutely aware of making sure that changing my behavior because I don't want to raise my son, who is 17 years old now, to have to recover from his childhood. I don't wanna have to have him go through 30 years of therapy to figure out how or why things happened to him the way they did or how he thinks or how he behaves. So it's very much in the forefront of my relationship with my son now as well, and my relationship with my mother. I've really started talking with my mother. My father's been dead now 6 years, so I can't address anything with him, but, we made amends many years ago, so we had a relationship before he passed away, but even having some conversations with my mom, and they were really intense in the beginning because she is in denial herself. She's a 75-year-old woman, and growing up in middle America, it's like she's got the pull yourselves up from the bootstraps mentality, and there's a lot to be said about that to a certain point because I'm very independent because of it, but it's also I'm very independent because of it is also it's a positive and a negative in my life, because I don't allow myself to really be me. I respond to things in just a very intense way. I always have. I still do, but I catch myself now and I recognize it when it's happening now. And that's a part of healing from trauma. I think it circles back to the point that you were saying that we have to have empathy and compassion for people because we don't know what they've been through. And people who respond that way, people who are intense, people who say you're being a victim, you have to pull yourself up from the bootstraps, I think those are the people who have trauma too. It's like we have this trauma response to each other. We're not dealing with
Absolutely.
it in a positive, constructive way. And those are the people who don't wanna deal with it in a positive, constructive way, I think.
Well, and we haven't even talked about really what trauma does to your
Well, let's
body.
talk about that. What does trauma I can tell you what it's done for mine, but, because it's like you say, the flight though, when you said that you made that point about, like, fleeing in your mind, that really struck me because I did that. I internalized it, and I took it out on myself. And I developed eating disorder because of it. And when I was a teenager, I had suicidal ideation. I don't as an adult. I maybe a couple of times early on in my adulthood, I experienced that, but as a teenager, I thought about it constantly. I didn't wanna be here, I didn't wanna be alive, but I didn't wanna be dead at the same time. I was just like I felt like I explain it like I felt like I just wanted to unzip my skin and step out from myself, is how I felt about it.
Uh,
Going in within yourself and the effects on your body, yes, let's talk about that.
I mean, it's now well documented that, well, we're at least starting to understand that we do store trauma in our body. And there are some things that are not necessarily explainable through medical science, things that people go through. Many times people used to call them psychosomatic symptoms because they would be real symptoms, but there was a sense that maybe sometimes they came from the brain. But that doesn't mean the symptoms are fake. It just means that the brain can send signals to the body in some ways that can be very painful, but not necessarily conclusive by medical diagnosis. And there's also certain disorders that are exacerbated by trauma and stress. Autoimmune disorders, in particular, can be very connected to trauma in how they respond.
And what exactly are autoimmune responses?
Well, typically there's situations where your immune system goes into overdrive, and that could be anything like lupus, or sometimes it's been linked to fibromyalgia or to chronic pain or chronic fatigue syndrome. And those are very hard to treat. But many times people suffer from multiple autoimmune issues at once. And fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome in particular have been very hard to treat, but also arthritis could be an autoimmune, definitely autoimmune. Crohn's disease is autoimmune. Well, what we know now, too, is that our gut and our brain are intimately connected. Your gut health and your brain health are two sides of the same coin. And also, where does immunity or healthy immunity come from? It comes from your gut. So we're just starting to scratch the surface on how our gut can be signs for us, but our gut can also be part of our brain healing. So that when we're doing our brain healing, we're also healing our bodies physically. Many people will talk about adrenal overload, which is just being overly stressed for so long, you fatigue your adrenal glands, which can put you at all kinds of risk, but also all your endocrine system in general and your gut biome are all connected. Your blood sugar, your hormones, adrenals, I mean, your pituitary, all of that is intimately connected. So we're just learning how to really heal the body as much as the mind. There's also really important work that's being done on trauma that involves the body. I mentioned something in a previous podcast about EMDR. That's about involving the brain and the body and the bilateral connection between left and right. All of that is connected to brain. I'm sure you've heard of therapeutic yoga. They've learned that actual movement activities have a very positive effect on anxiety. So there are types of yoga that are specifically designed for people with trauma, and that trauma focused yoga is very sensitive to the fact that people's bodies may store trauma, right? And so they do gentle movements where there is an opportunity for the person to work on movement and work on releasing some of that stored trauma. So it is a very specific type of yoga, but there's also other types of yoga, that anybody can do that have benefits, actually have tremendous benefits for trauma. One other thing I wanted to add about that was about when you get stuck in your lower brain, when a person who has had trauma gets stuck in their amygdala and their whole body is wired for fight or flight. What's been learned through research has been that sensory motor activities are actually geared towards the lower brain. So, what are sensory motor activities? Well, that's anything that strengthens sensory motor connections. So, that would be things like music and art. Basically, what we do with little bitty children, to help their lower brain develop is what we can actually do with trauma survivors to help release that trauma. So, sometimes we think we have to start in the upper brain where there's cognitive functioning, but actually, most people who had childhood trauma are stuck in the lower brain. So it helps to do those basic activities. And so what bothers me about that is, how because of funding issues, schools have repeatedly gutted art and music programs. And for kids who are coming in with trauma and who may be stuck, they're not getting the stimulation to their brain if they're not getting that art and music. I mean, you can definitely get it elsewhere, but, incorporating it into school programming had so many benefits that people didn't even realize. We know music and art is good for kids, but what we've learned is music and art is especially good for the lower brain.
That's a really interesting point. Because when I was younger, when I was going through school, I was in music. I learned to play the piano, I learned to play the flute, and there's a lot to be said about that. And then when I was going through my divorce, I really started working out heavily. I started doing CrossFit and lifting weights, heavy weights. And I swear to God, it was the most therapeutic thing I could have done for myself. It saved me. It saved me from going into a dark hole. I believe that 100%. And just the way how it makes your body feel, I think is just a perk, but how it makes you feel mentally, I was able to take my stress out at the gym by throwing things around, and it worked. It worked
Wow.
100%.
Yes.
So that's a really interesting point with the music and art, though, in school. I never even thought to connect those 2.
So you're talking about kids who probably don't have therapy, but who have experienced trauma. And here's the other rub to that. Not only are if they don't get music and art, are they going to get help for their trauma, if they're in science and math and their brain is stuck in the amygdala, they're not going to get any science and math,
That is really
you know.
interesting.
So we're trying to teach kids with things that their brains aren't ready for if they've experienced a lot of complex trauma, and then we're not giving them the things that could actually heal their brains. So we have to really consider what we're exposing children to and what they're capable of being exposed to when they've experienced a lot of trauma. And this is not just kids, what we've tried to do is develop trauma sensitive schools. And what that means is we've tried to identify school systems that are really good at identifying and being sensitive to trauma. So it doesn't mean you have to treat the trauma in the school system, but that all of your activities and all of your approaches are trauma sensitive. And that has not taken off like it should. I
Well,
mean,
that's what Montessori is though, right? You know, that just makes me connect it to Montessori because when my son started school, he went to preschool starting at 2 years old, and he went to a Montessori preschool. And Montessori preschool is all about that sort of thing. It's about sensory and touch. It's about art and, you know, you're counting it teaches them to, like, read and do math and all of that at a very early age, but it's done through play, and it's done through things like painting or, you know, designing things or putting things together. So that makes me connect it to that, and then there's also it makes me think of the Waldorf school system. Do you know anything about that?
no, no.
I know a little bit about it because my sister taught at one of those schools in Arizona at one point, and that one I would think would also be very therapeutic for kids because they do things like knitting and they do things like art. So it's like child-directed education. They're able
Uh-huh.
to kind of focus on I may be saying this wrong, so, you know, nobody hold me accountable for this. This is just what I remember, but it was based on kids kind of leading with what it is they fell into. You know, so
Oh,
there was a
yeah,
lot
yeah.
of art, there was a lot of that kind of, instruction going on, so I would think that both of those somehow would be great for parents who have children who've gone through trauma, who aren't necessarily going through therapy, or even if they are, that those 2 school systems would be something to look into. That is really interesting. I never thought to connect those 2 like that.
Well, where this has come from is really the work of Bruce Duncan Perry. And if anybody's not familiar with him, he basically developed the neurosequential model of therapeutics, which basically means he sees trauma as a bottom up kind of healing. So basically, you can't meet the person where they are if their brain is stuck in a different place. So you have to meet the brain where it is in the healing process. He wrote a really good book with Oprah recently called What Happened to You. That book was designed to really ask the questions about trauma that people sometimes don't clue into. So when you say what happened to you, you're not telling someone they experienced a traumatic event. You're simply asking them what happened in their life. And this is tied to something called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So now they've developed this tool called ACEs that really hones in on children's childhood trauma experiences by not just asking them, what did you experience, but what did you see growing up, which is just as important as what you experienced. If you saw a lot of traumatic things, you didn't have to experience them firsthand, such as your example where you saw a lot of violence, right?
Yes, yes.
And so the adverse childhood experiences scale has been used widely to kind of measure trauma. And what we're learning is more people have high ACEs score than they realize they've had. When people take this test, they realize their ACEs may have been a little higher than what they thought. Because we definitely hone into things like, oh, I experienced physical abuse or I experienced sexual abuse, but we don't hone into what did I see, what did I witness, what was I exposed to,
Right,
you know?
because I think an important point, right, is that the brain just knows trauma. It can't distinguish between what type of trauma it is, like between sexual
No,
violence, physical violence, seeing violence, going through, you know, a car accident, so to say. It just recognizes trauma.
exactly. And because the part of the brain that recognizes trauma and kicks in for survival excludes any upper brain, right? None of the upper brain is involved when you're in a traumatic situation. It's all lower brain kicks in. So we can't expect the lower brain to distinguish, and we can't expect the lower brain to have recall of every single event because the lower brain hones into the events that it considers dangerous and it kind of blocks out the rest. So sometimes we ask people to remember every detail of a traumatic event, they only recall certain things, and those certain things are very vivid to them, but they may have blocked out extraneous information during that traumatic event so that they could go into survival mode. So we have to be cautious when we're questioning people about traumatic events that we don't expect them to their description to be the totality of the event. They will describe what they experienced in that traumatic event. And what they experienced was narrowed down to what their lower brain could absorb.
That's really interesting when it comes to justice for me. When people are put on the stand on the stand and they are talking about their traumatic experience to get some sort of justice, how much of it do they really block out and not remember, you
Right.
know? And we put so much weight on that.
And we expect them to not, but it's more we should expect them to block out certain things.
Yeah, it makes total sense that they would.
Absolutely. And we can only question them based on what they recalled at that moment. But I mean, to remember the totality. For instance, if it was a violent crime at a school event, they might have honed in on a school shooter situation. Their brain may have honed in on what exactly was happening in that classroom, right? And when they were running down the hall, they don't remember anything. They just remember being outside, getting outside. That is normal for a person going through trauma. Not that their upper brain is absorbing every detail around them as they're running outside. It's normal for them to be in tunnel vision and to be focused on survival. That's what their brain is doing. So, yes, the justice system has to be sensitive to that and to understand trauma does not recall every detail. It only recalls the detail related to survival.
And this ACEs, is this something that people can take online? Is this a test they can take online outside of a therapeutic environment to kind of guide them to what direction they need to go?
Yes, it's totally available online. It's a very short quiz, but it will give you an ACEs score, which kind of guides you into knowing the level of trauma you may have experienced. And if you go into a situation to talk about your events, you can talk about your ACEs score, with a therapist as well, but it's a free and public domain. Anybody can take it.
Wonderful. We'll include that in our show notes, a link to that in our show notes also.
Also, there is a very good book by Basil van de Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. Basil was the first to really write about in this century. All of the work has been done in this century, so we're very young in our trauma understanding. He wrote a book about how the body stores trauma and how we store trauma that is just incredible. So anything you can read by Basil or by Bruce Duncan Perry is going to be very enlightening about trauma. So I thought maybe what we could do when we're talking about empathy for trauma, I thought, you were talking at the beginning of the show about a survivor of the recent Michigan case. I think it's important for people to practice empathy. So, what I would like for our listeners to do is, as you share his story, to maybe practice empathy because he shares some very vivid details. And there will be a tendency by some listeners to insert our own judgment into what he's sharing, right? Oh, what was he doing? Or why didn't he do this? Or why didn't he do that? And I want the listener to really suspend judgment during your description and really just focus on empathy for this survivor. And empathy means just trying to put ourselves in the horrible position he was in and really just totally immerse ourselves in that without any kind of extraneous judgment coming into play. And let's see if we can practice empathy just in listening to his story. Because if we can practice empathy listening to his story through a podcast, we can also practice empathy listening to someone's story live. So I would like the viewers to do that if you don't mind. And then you just kind of read what he shared. And let's do that exercise together.
At the beginning of this podcast, we mentioned that just this week, in March of 2022, the University of Michigan finalized a lawsuit brought forth by over 1,000 former students who were sexually assaulted by former U of M sports doctor Robert Anderson. The allegations date back to 1975. I want to share the story of one of these former students, Jon Vaughn. Jon was a former football player for the University of Michigan, who also went on to play in the NFL for the New England Patriots, Seattle Seahawks, and Kansas City Chiefs. Jon is a voice who came forward during this lawsuit because he refused to be labeled John Doe. In the lawsuit, he was labeled John Doe number 32. I recently watched a video on Jon's YouTube channel where he explains what happened at the hands of Dr. Robert Anderson. And I want to share that with our listeners because I think it's very important that people see that sexual assault doesn't just happen to women, it also happens to men. And I think it also shows the pervasiveness of it within our society and the importance of why we have to stop being silent about this. So Robert Anderson worked for the University of Michigan from 1966 until 2003. Many students filed complaints against Robert Anderson dating back to 1975, and those complaints were ignored. According to Jon Vaughn, from his freshman year all the way through his senior year, he was sexually assaulted by Robert Anderson numerous times. Robert Anderson had a partnership with a fertility clinic and told his athletes that they did testing on sperm count and that these athletes were part of this testing. At the hand of Dr. Robert Anderson, these young men were subjected to constant rectal examinations, and then they were brought to manual ejaculation by Anderson's own hand. So instead of giving these young men a jar to go and collect these semen samples themselves, Robert Anderson manually ejaculated these athletes to collect the samples, telling them that it had to be done and collected a certain way, otherwise, the samples would be no good. According to Jon, the settlement is a step in the right direction, but he and the other survivors want answers. They want conversations that are not being had. He and other survivors want to have face-to-face time with the Board of Regents and the Office of the President at the University of Michigan, which they have not been granted. Their whole goal is student safety, and as part of the settlement this week with the University of Michigan, it included forced changes to the safety for sexual assault. So it'll be interesting to see where this lawsuit goes from here. It was one of the largest, I think it's just the second largest lawsuit that was brought. It beat out the Michigan State lawsuit with Larry Nassar by 10 million, or Michigan State lawsuit beat it out by only 10 million. So Michigan State's lawsuit against Larry Nassar was 500 million. University of Michigan's settlement was 490 million. I'll also provide a link to an article that I found that states several other lawsuits for colleges across the country just dating back to 2017. So tens and thousands of students who are constantly subjected to sexual assault and sexual violence and sexual abuse at the hands of trusted doctors at their universities. It's mind-boggling,
Epidemic.
the pervasiveness of this. Yes, it's literally an epidemic in this country, and why is this not being shouted from the rooftops?
I know.
I didn't see the Michigan information in the local news, because I'm currently in Michigan right now, but I didn't see that in the national news. I had somebody sent it to me, is how I found out about it, and then I went down the hole and watched all of these videos with Jon Vaughn on his YouTube channel and how he is really the only one out there out of all of these abused students, previous students, he's the only one actually choosing to use his voice. So I think that is something we have to change. And I don't know how to change that with trauma victims. I don't know how to do that. But if we keep being silent about this, it's going to continue.
It's a vicious cycle, when society sweeps under the rug these things, but also shames the victims. It is completely understandable why victims don't speak up because the shame is so hard to bear. If you if we don't have empathy for these victims and hold them up and support them, then why would they come forward? Why would they risk being subjected to that kind of scrutiny and judgment for something they had no control over? We have to start by making their stories, by holding sacred space for their stories and listening with empathy and not with judgment. And then I think more people will come forward, but it's a very pervasive thing that there's a certain segment of the population that always skips to judgment. It's very hard for someone to come forward when they're subjected to that.
I mean, there's so much trauma in society. There just is. Most everybody I know has had some sort of trauma at some level or another. So you'd think that alone would make people try to understand somebody else and want to hear somebody else and can relate to someone else, but we don't. We don't, and it makes me angry that we are judging the victims and we are giving the victims more of a punishment than we are the
Exactly.
perpetrators.
It's more punishing to be a victim than it is to be a perpetrator in our country. That's very true. I mean, think about even though eventually Larry Nasser and Anderson were caught, think about how long they were able to continue despite people going to the administration, despite complaints about their behavior. Think about how long these universities protected them versus these victims. Why would a student ever feel safe going forward with that kind of track record?
Well, there's some positive coming out of it the past couple of years with these men being held accountable, with Nasser being held accountable, with Sandusky being held accountable. I don't know about these other colleges with, I have not heard of any court cases with the perpetrators there. Anderson is gone, dead. He can't be held accountable. But I think if he's not able to be held accountable, then it falls back on the administration of the school who knew about these incidents. They were reported, they were aware of it, and they didn't act on it. They are the next in line to be held accountable, I think. I don't think they should be let go or dismissed. I think they should be held accountable for the role that they played in criminal activity, quite honestly. The University of Michigan shouldn't just get a fine. The people, if they are still alive, who were involved from 1975 up until this lawsuit was filed, if those administrators who were involved at that time frame are still alive, they should be brought forth and they should be held accountable. There should be some level of criminal conduct or criminal charges that should be brought against them for their criminal conduct. That's how I feel about it. We have to start getting serious about holding everyone who is involved in these situations accountable. And if you're silent, you're complicit. That's my opinion. If you know there is injustice going on and you're doing nothing about it because you don't wanna be bothered or you don't wanna stir something up or you don't want your university shamed, no, not okay. Not okay in my book.
Silence is complicit. That's very
Absolutely.
true. If you see something, do something. Do not stay silent. We have to we have to rally around victims as well, and support their stories and support what they're trying to do. And we have to be, as a society, understanding that, it's a hard thing to come forward about and that we have to have empathy and respect for what they're trying to do. I remember watching the Nasser documentary, and he had, like, I think it was like 2 days of victim statements almost that they did. Incredibly powerful watching one after the other get up and do a victim statement to him. I don't remember how many there were. There were many, many victims that came forward and did victim statements.
There
And
were hundreds, weren't there? There were
yeah,
hundreds of girls.
it was just so powerful, about how they were able to gain strength to do that. I don't know why we're not shouting it from the rooftops either. I mean, it's so pervasive, so common. You're not safe in college campuses. You're not safe on downtown living alone. You're not safe necessarily with every doctor you come in contact with or with every professional you come in contact with. I mean, it's a very common thing to be victimized at some level by somebody.
Yeah, that's pretty frightening if you allow yourself to really think about it. Like, who can you trust? Because 70% of the people who experience sexual assault experience it at the hands of somebody they know and trust.
Right.
It's a horrifying statistic. So let's loop back to these two rape kit testing. I want to have a conversation about that. This was really critical in your own story. This is how your perpetrator, your rapist, I don't even want to call him a perpetrator, your rapist was found. was through testing your rape kit, what, 15 years after the fact, was it? 12 years after the fact? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how many rape kits are actually collected each year. And out of those collected, how many are not tested?
So when I first learned about the backlog process and the situation with the backlog of rape kits, it was from an HBO documentary and a incredible survivor named Natasha who created something called Natasha's Justice Project. And her goal was to shine the light. Her story was very similar to mine. She received justice years after the fact through DNA. And then it sent her down the rabbit hole of looking at all the untested rape kits. And I've forgotten the name of the documentary, but it was very powerful just talking about the backlog of rape kits. So then more recently, the Joyful Heart Foundation has done a lot of work with ending the backlog. And the Joyful Heart Foundation was founded by Mariska Hargitay, based on her work on the SVU television series and coming in contact with so many victims. She learned about the pervasiveness of sexual assault and definitely the pervasiveness of untested rape kits. So the cool thing that In the Backlog does is they have on their website, they have a thing where you can jump to a state and see how many backlogged items they have in the state. So, for instance, I'm going to jump to Alabama, my home state. So, it gives you a snapshot of that state and untested kits unknown, testing unknown. There's no statewide inventory. No, the state has not committed to testing. No, the state has not mandated testing, but it does grant victims the right to be informed. So they have no tracking system and no statewide mandates to test their rape kits.
No mandates to test rape kits. So they're literally just collecting rape kits and they're just sitting there.
Yes.
What has to be done in order for a rape kit to be tested? I would think that would be an automatic.
Well, you have to what they've done within the backlog, and originally when Natasha's Justice Project was try to go to the state legislatures to implement mandates, right? To get people to take accountability for all these untested rape kits. Because if I skip to another state, like I'm trying to think of a state that has,
Do Texas.
let me do
Do this,
Texas.
do my state, do Texas.
There are 6,108 untested kits in Texas. And now they have a mandate that they are now testing all newly collected kits. And they're trying to go back in the inventory of the 6,108 and test those. So they've
That makes me
actually
happy.
jumped on board, believe it or not.
Yeah, that is surprising to me, but I'm happy to hear that.
So here's a quote from the website. To me, the backlog is one of the clearest and most shocking demonstrations of how we regard these crimes in our society. Testing rape kits sends a fundamental and crucial message to victims of sexual violence. You matter. What happened to you matters. Your case matters. For that reason, the Joyful Heart Foundation, which I found in 2004, has made ending the rape kit backlog our number one advocacy priority. And that's from Mariska Hargitay. So supposedly every 73 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted in the United States. The victim's body actually becomes the evidence. So your body is the evidence, which is why you go to the hospital and get the rape or the rape crisis center and get this done. But that includes photographs, swabs, which are very invasive and exhaustive, and almost like you said, a re traumatization to the victim. So all that process takes about 4 to 6 hours to complete. So
46 hours?
4 to 6.
Oh, 40.
So immediately following a sexual assault, you may be spending 4 to 6 hours in a hospital, ER, or a rape crisis center collecting this evidence. And that evidence is preserved as what we call a rape kit. The rape kit backlog is what has been collected up until now that sits in warehouses. So when we talk about ending the backlog, we're talking about doing something with all of those rape kits that have sat untested And we're also talking about moving forward, testing kits immediately, not waiting and letting them sit. So it's a two-prong approach. First, we want people to address their backlog. And then second, we want people to address going forward how they're going to handle rape kit and not just adding them to the backlog. But we're talking across the country. I mean, each state, you can go to the website yourself and look up your state. Each state response has been very different to this. We have no uniform way of approaching this. We have to go state by state. So, whatever state you're in, you can talk to your legislative representatives about ending the backlog. And I mean, that's where you can do something because you have to approach it on a state by state level.
So there was nothing that this movement did to address it at the congressional level to where it's mandated for the United States and there's funding for it from Congress?
No, it's all
I
state
would
by
think that
state.
would be the most efficient way, but
So there's two reasons why we need to do this. First of all, as of June of 20, I'm reading this from the website as well. As of June of 2021, testing of these backlog rape kits has resulted in the identification of more than 1,320 suspected serial rapists. So just by testing backlog, they've identified over 1,000 serial rapists. These serial rapists were linked to kits in just 3 cities, but had committed crimes across 40 states and Washington, D.C.
oh my goodness.
So it wasn't just rape, they were linked to other violent crimes as well. So imagine, look, we have this body of evidence that we can use to capture these people. That's why testing the backlog matters. We can catch people. The person who sexually assaulted me would never have been caught without DNA. He would have never answered for his crime without DNA.
No.
And that's true of so many serial rapists. So, just go on the website, read the stories, learn about ending the backlog and how it is something your state is able to do. They can really move forward with this. And there's some states that have completely done it. They've tested all their backlog and they're testing everything moving forward as it comes in.
That's encouraging.
So every state can do it. They just need the support and the pressure from the public.
Absolutely. Pressure on your legislatures.
So I can't say enough about these organizations, about Natasha's bravery when she came forward and started Natasha's Justice Project and Joyful Heart Foundation and what they've done for victims and creating this system, a tracking system and really developing a plan of action to bring this forward for each state. And I mean, these are great organizations and, you can support them by sharing their message, by donating, by getting involved at a local level. There's lots of things people can do.
I think we need to start doing this in general for everything. Getting involved at your local level and changing the process at your local level, standing for justice at your local level, electing the right people into office at your local level. All politics start locally first, then you go nationally and start holding legislators accountable for the people and not just for corporations, but hold them accountable for the people. It's the only way we're going to bring change to anything that needs changed in this country.
Yep, we are powerful locally, and that transcends to statewide and nationally too.
It's the only way we're going to change the narrative. That's what I wanna say. It's the only way we're going to change the narrative in this country.
Right.
So, Leisha, what is the first step that you would suggest that someone do after they experience a traumatic event? Regardless of what that trauma is to them, what's the first thing they should do?
The first thing anyone should do after a traumatic event is establish safety, whatever that looks like for them. Every traumatic event is not necessarily a threat to our safety, but it certainly triggers that part of our brain that needs safety. So finding a safe place to land, whether that be on your living room couch, your best friend's extra bedroom, going back home to your parents' house, whatever it means, find a place of safety immediately. and attend to your basic core needs, whatever they are: sleep, rest, food, hydration. The body in survival mode needs the basics to feel safe. And so, that means taking care of yourself totally, feeling safe and being treated with care by the people around you. And following that, it is important as soon as you can to talk about the event with somebody. It doesn't have to be with a therapist if you're not ready for a therapist, but talk about it with your partner, with your friend, with your pastor, with whoever you trust to hold space for your story and not judge you. Crisis line, any sorts of crisis lines, and, get the story out, because there is a tendency sometimes to hold that in, and that can create problems down the road. Even if it's clumsily told or you only tell part of the details, just tell as much as you can to somebody you trust. And then moving forward, you can determine what kind of professional help you need and what kind of safety precautions you need to feel safe. What they've done essentially with mass survivors, such as children, when children experience a mass situation like they experienced on 9/11 in New York, immediately what the volunteers did was they came in and started having the children draw right away. Because, kids obviously can't tell their story like an adult, but they immediately started having the children draw their stories.
That is a wonderful idea.
And that's very therapeutic to a child. So if your child has witnessed a traumatic event, it is perfectly okay as a parent or a teacher. You don't have to be a mental health professional to say, "Can you just draw for me what happened or how you're feeling?" or anything like that. Children will express themselves through drawings, much easier than they will through words. So give that option to a child. And so what they did was they went into these schools and stuff after 9/11 and just started having the kids draw. Drawing is therapeutic. It's sensory motor activity, and it touches on the survival brain. So as an adult victim, you also have that option. If you're not comfortable telling your story, use art. Write it out. Do something to get it out of your brain and
Yeah,
own.
journaling is
Yes.
very effective. It is a
Yes.
very effective tool for adults.
So those are easy things and simple things people can do after a trauma that make a world of difference. That certainly not doesn't resolve your trauma, but it starts you on the path. I think that's the best thing you can do is, get on the path as easily as possible without judgment or ridicule. Some people don't have that luxury, and that's what's so sad. But if you have the ability to find safety, do it. I was in a terrible car accident when I was, it wasn't many years ago. It involved me and a motorcyclist, basically. I hit him on the motorcycle. I didn't see him, and he popped into the air, and I thought I killed him for a brief minute. And that was extremely traumatic for me, and I'm sure for him. He went to the hospital. I went home. I didn't have injuries, but my mind was a mess. I was completely stuck in flashbacks of that event. All I could hear was the the metal and the tires, and I could see it over and over in my head. So I went home, I cried, I talked to my husband. I spent the next day in bed crying, talking to friends who were checking on me. And then the next day, I felt a little better, But even something that like that we, so many of us have experienced is car accidents. I mean, we don't even think about how that impacts us. But months later, when I went to the dentist, if I heard a dental tool, the grinding metal of a dental tool, I would go into a flashback.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
So I had to kind of like bring music to the dentist office so I could overshadow the metal sound. And it was an isolated event, and luckily the victim survived, but it did a number on my brain, and people don't often realize that, something that happens in an instant and nothing tragic, nothing too tragic happens. You think, "Oh, well, this is fine. This is fine." No, your brain stores that. When I thought I was killing somebody, my brain went into that mode. This is life or death.
Our brain is a fascinating thing. It truly is. How it responds to everything, literally everything, how it responds to trauma, how it responds to events.
But, I went through that event trying to do the right things and trying to nurture myself, trying to make sure that I was attending to my own mental health, but also that I wasn't bottling it up, and that helped a lot. It did.
So the takeaway here is be good to yourself, take care of yourself, be good to others, take care of those who you're responsible are in your family. There are ways to heal. Healing is possible. Healing happens. You have to take the steps to make it happen.
Yes, and one last add-on to that, I would say your brain changes when you experience a traumatic event, but your brain can also change again in healing. No matter how much complex trauma you've suffered, it has changed your brain. But the good news is there's healing and there's change for the brain for the better too. Your brain is highly plastic. Your
Plasticity?
brain has much plasticity,
Yeah.
and your brain can heal. Just like your brain can be changed by trauma, it can also be changed for healing.
Thank you for this conversation today, Leisha.
Thank you, Tamara.
In our show notes, we will have links to all of the resources we discussed in this episode. If you are a victim of sexual assault, please know that you are not alone and it is not your fault. You are strong and you can recover from this. In our show notes for this episode, we provide information on resources along with links and phone numbers for support. You can also reach out to us directly at pcspodcast.com and click on our contact tab, or email us directly at info@pcspodcast.com, and we will help direct you to support. Thank you for listening to this episode of Humanhood. We are happy you are here. For a breakdown of this episode, please visit pcspodcast.com/humanhood for our show notes and for more information on how you can get involved. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us grow by giving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and supporting us through Patreon by becoming a founding member. As a founding patron, you receive a special subscription rate that will lock in for the life of your subscription. We provide our patrons with a plethora of awesome behind-the-scenes perks and special merchandise, along with access to our Patreon-exclusive podcasts, Drunk Politics and WTF. Become a founding member today at patreon.com/powerfulpodcasts or find the link in our show notes. This podcast is brought to you by Powerful Podcasts and is written, produced, and hosted by me, Tamara Graham, with co-host Leisha Moody Miller. You can find us at pcspodcast.com or wherever you find your podcasts. For a full list, please refer to our website. Follow us on social media at Powerful Podcasts and on Twitter at Powerful Pods. Be sure to join us next week for another powerful episode of Humanhood.